Hi there. I'm Tom Field. I'm Senior Vice President of Editorial with Information Security Media Group, and I am delighted to welcome you back to one of our latest leadership discussions where we bring together the top minds in cybersecurity and business to talk about the topics that matter the most. And what better topic to discuss today, the one that's occupied our mind share for nearly 2 years now, the topic of zero trust. So, zero trust has become both the security model of choice for enterprises that are looking to up their game and change the relationship dynamic between the attackers and the defenders. It's also become a pure marketing movement, yet far too valuable and necessary a concept and operational model to be abused by hype alone. Zero trust advocates are pushing back. The collective mission to enable the journey to zero trust is a precondition to operating a safe and secure IT environment, regardless of industry, regardless of organizational size. So joining me today to discuss the issues around zero trust are cybersecurity leaders in OT and in IT, experts in zero trust principles and identity management. Let's meet our group here. We have got the godfather of the godfather of zero trust. That would be John Kindervag.
Thank you, Tom.
In addition to John, we've got two zero trust identity-centered experts, Richard Bird.
Thanks, Tom. Good to be here.
We've got Jeremy Grant from Venable.
Great to be here. Thanks, Tom.
We also are joined by Cyril, Perducat, CTO of Rockwell Automation. Cyril.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks for having me today.
And Raghu, Nandakumara, the field CTO with Illumio. Again, a market leader in zero trust IT security.
Great to be here. Thank you.
So, gentlemen, let's jump right into our conversation. Zero trust has been incorrectly called a product. It's been called a service. It's been called a lifestyle, the state of mind, a being by the markets in general. Opponents are convinced that it's just marketing salad dressing. John Kindervag, I believe you disagree. Can you, in your own words, define zero trust? I hope by now you can. And describe the elements or principles that must be in a genuine zero trust strategy. John, it started with you, so this question starts with you.
Yeah, zero trust is a cybersecurity strategy that focuses on the fact that we have a broken trust model where some systems are considered trusted and that others are untrusted. And that is the fundamental problem in cybersecurity, because there is no such thing as trust in digital systems. It's a human emotion. And so that's what I identified 11 or 12 years ago through research at Forrester Research. And it's gone on and taken a life of its own. But zero trust is primarily focused on protecting sensitive things, sensitive data, sensitive assets, sensitive applications, or sensitive services. And by doing that, it leverages a lot of different technology. Microsegmentation technology, identity technology, network security technology, host security technology, but it uses them in a completely different way, focusing on what I call the protect surface, taking the overall attack surface, shrinking it down orders of magnitude to something very small and easily known so that you can break up the problem in small, usable chunks and build your zero trust environments out incrementally, iteratively, and non-disruptively.
Let's hear some other perspectives on this. I don't expect you to just echo John, but how each of you?
To me, zero trust is the logical conclusion of where we always needed to go in cybersecurity, which is to a very identity-centric approach to security. And that for years, I think we took this approach of building these walled fortresses, focused on a strong perimeter, but left a really flimsy screen door at the front gate, which was the identity layer that we didn't bother to protect. It was usually nothing more than a password. And so attackers did the very logical thing, which was just ignored the walls we had built, stole a password, and cruised in through the front door. So I think where I get excited about, zero trust, at least parts of it, is how do you start shifting people to more of an identity-centric model of cybersecurity, where you put a lot of emphasis on securing that front door and then sharply limiting what people can do after they've gotten through it?
I spent 20 plus years in the corporate world and a good 16 or 17 years of that in banking and financial services. And some of the patterns that are associated to zero trust are not unknown or uncommon patterns to those of us that work in highly regulated industries. If we think about mainframe security access control was zero trust before zero trust, up to and including confirmation of session log out, right? Which is actually a continuous weakness today in almost every security architecture, which is persistent access. Which, to John's point, if you think about what persistent access really is, it is an extension of trust, right? You have authenticated once, and now you have access to this asset, to infinity and beyond. And I think the second part of zero trust for me is, first recognizing that it is an understandable pattern, but it's an extension of that pattern to your assets and inventories across your entire organization. But I think when you look at the criticisms of zero trust, I think you're looking at something that approximates corporate politics. And the reason is that entire security architectures and entire organizational structures for security over the last 30 years have been defined and bound up in the acquisition and deployment of solutions. And when you introduce a new framework, not even necessarily a specific architecture, you introduce threat into those organizations at the organizational and budgetary levels, right? I have built a fiefdom, I have built a kingdom around threat and vulnerability management or around firewall security. And when you start to see that pushback, then you have to raise a very, very important question. Many companies are still operating on the old OSI 7-layer model. Many companies have, by way of statement, said that they are focused on defense and depth. Empirically, all of the curves are going the wrong direction relative to results. If these architectures were working the way that they are touted as working, we might see some improvement against exploits and breaches. The reality is we're not. They're accelerating. So I just look at zero trust and say, why don't we just try something new that isn't necessarily as new as we sometimes suggest it is?
Now, that's a great start to our conversation. I want to shift gears a little bit here. We have seen what seems like countless discussions about how to implement zero trust. It seems those closer to the challenge embrace an incremental approach. So my question for the group, what's the best way to implement a zero trust strategy, and how does one go about it best practice-wise? Richard, perhaps you can kick us off here and pass the baton to your colleagues.
I struggled operationally for a number of years with zero trust from an implementation standpoint. Giving guidance to solution providers, agencies, governments, organizations around the world. And the reason is because I didn't understand, and I can speak specifically to my interests relative to implementation. I really didn't understand the interplay of identity with zero trust well enough. And that was complicated by not just the identity solution space, but virtually every solutions provider on the planet suggesting that their solution is zero trust. And so John and I were having dinner, and in the course of the conversation, John said something that really kind of locked it all for me. He said, zero trust consumes identity. And the instant that I thought about identity both as a consumable service and a consumable category of data that could be used to drive zero trust transactionally, it all clicked for me. All of a sudden, I was like, wow, all of the work that we're doing around unified profiles and multi-factor authentication and multivariate authentication, taking risk signals as authenticators, began to immediately make sense in the context of zero trust. So when I'm giving folks guidance around the implementation focus, mine is always focusing on do you really have a solid understanding of who's who, how many you have, have you driven out all of the redundancy, duplication within your identity stores? Do you have a solid focus on role-based access control? I think Raghu mentioned it. It's really a foundational conversation from an implementation standpoint when it comes to identity, because if your foundations aren't correct in identity, your ability to achieve zero trust is significantly limited. So John, I'll kick it over to you since you really helped me understand that quite a bit better.
The misunderstanding is zero trust equals identity, and I can prove that's not true with two words: Snowden, Manning. They were trusted users on trusted devices. They had powerful and robust identity systems, powerful and cumbersome to use multi-factor authentication systems, but nobody looked at their packets post-authentication. So when I originally wrote the first paper about it, I said, we have to adopt least privilege, but enforce it. So we've had least privilege as a concept for a long time, but no one wanted to enforce it. And when you would go in as a pen tester, like I did, or as an architect, like I've done, you would see that essentially everybody had access to everything. And a lot of zero trust was a response to the movement to flatten network environments to make it easier to do vMotion, move virtual machines around. So it consumes identity, and zero trust actually has a simple methodology for deploying it. There's a 5-step methodology. Define your protect surfaces. What do you need to protect, right? Map the transaction flows. How does the system work together as a system? Step 3 then becomes architecture. Most people want a reference architecture that they can plug and play, and that never worked for us. I mean, I've done that a lot. And the customer would say, well, thanks for giving us this wonderful network, but you've given us round holes and we have square pegs. What do we do? And we say, well, you get a free whittling knife with the technology you just bought. And then the 4th step is to create policy. The 5th step is monitor and maintain. And you re-inject all that stuff back into the system in a feedback loop and build it out, build each protect surface out better and better. And then you go on to the next protect surface and the next protect surface and the next protect surface. So it's incremental. And if you follow that methodology, which lots of organizations have, you will be successful. And I always get messages from people showing me, hey, look, this ransomware attack was stopped because of the way zero trust works and doesn't allow those kinds of connections to happen, or blocks them at certain places. And so again, it's focusing on protecting something. So it's abstracted from the technology. And this is one thing that we need to understand, is that it will never equal a product. It's always an idea or a strategy that consumes many products, including identity.
Following on from what John said and tying it into something that Richard said, like zero trust is very much about understanding behaviors and understanding what is necessary behavior versus what is not required, and then using that to go and build the policy that you want to enforce and ultimately enforcing that. I think what we find is that, tying to what John said, is where end users of like those who are wanting to adopt zero trust, in our case, it's around microsegmentation, and those who are willing to take that journey, take that approach of understanding what is required and then moving forward, we know they are successful because we've seen that. What we also see is that customers essentially, and I think John and Richard kind of alluded to this, is that they essentially want that ability to bring in a product and press a button and say, I now have a zero trust security posture. Right, that is just unrealistic. You need to put in the effort to understand your interactions, understand your behaviors, and then use those to drive your policy and go and enforce in order to be successful. And that's the mind shift that I think is required for greater adoption of sort of a zero trust approach.
So I just want to take a sec. I'm going to argue with John just a tiny bit, in that when we, talking about zero trust not being about identity and pointing to Snowden and Manning, the issue there from my perspective wasn't that they didn't have identity security, it was that they weren't using it well, particularly on the authorization side. There was an assumption within the military, within the NSA, that once you're inside the wall, you can basically go see anything, because they weren't enforcing least privilege. They weren't enforcing fine-grained authorization. Why should, somebody who was essentially an admin like Snowden have had access to some of this data? Well, if they were paying attention to the authorization side, that wouldn't have happened. But back, Tom, to your question, in terms of where would I start, this is one reason a lot of times I advise clients, well, what have you done in identity governance? In that so much of implementing this properly starts with knowing what identities you have, how they're created and removed, and most importantly, what are you allowed to do with them? And that's a foundational piece that you need to get in place, that you can then build on with, I think, some other controls. But if you don't have that single building block, I don't know how you can go implement.
But the issue is that, yes, people do authorization poorly and access control poorly. And that's endemic to our whole business, because we've had a trust model that said once you're inside the network, you can have access to anything that you wanted. And that's true in CyberNet, right? I mean, a good friend of mine was one of the primary people prosecuting one of those things. And he said, when I got this case, like, how did these people have access to this stuff? And he realized it was the broken trust model, right? So the trust model is the thing that you focus on, because we anthropomorphize the network, right? We say Jeremy's on the network, or John is on the network, or Tom is on the network, and none of us are, right? We're not. Our identity is asserted to be generated. Our packets are generated by an asserted identity, right? There's an assertion that John is generating these packets. But I was talking to a person in the government, and I said, well, if somebody comes in and puts a gun to my head and makes me get up from my computer, is there a transference of identity where they become me? And he says, yeah, well, that happens all the time. And I said, no, it does not. Nobody puts a gun to your head. And he said, no, it's not a real gun. It's a virtual gun. It's a threat. It's blackmail. It's bribery. All those things happen all the time. So an individual, even if they have good authorization, could do malicious things in the environment unless you're looking at the packets, because this is all about packets, not people. People are not packets. It's just packets going back and forth. Ones and zeros is represented by electrons and photons. So yes, we have to consume identity properly, and we have to be serious about it, and not just, it was easy to just, provision somebody, give them a domain account, and go for it, right? So, but you have to have that account applied to a policy, and that's where everything gets tied together. But Cyril, I know you're doing a lot of work around IoT security, OT security. You guys are focusing on a different part of the industry than maybe some of the rest of us are.
Yeah. So when we look at what is happening in the manufacturing space, I want to start from a comment you made, John, on I think identity is a foundation, but it's not sufficient, because when we look at what has happened over the past 5 years in industrial space, insider threat is real, social engineering is real. So you can trust people, but they could be leverage on people that will make them do things that are not right. And even if they could be trusted as an individual member of a company, they could have leverage to have them do different things. But it's not fundamentally different with machines. You have we have cases. I'm thinking about SolarWinds, firmware modifications. In the industrial space, the idea to consider that the shop floor is a safe space, is a closed space, like we have seen historically, is fundamentally wrong. When I see the reality of the way our customers are operating, there are many third parties, there are many contractors, suppliers, technology vendors that are operating in this manufacturing environment. Can we trust all of them? Can maybe all of them are facing the same kind of leverage that I was discussing before. I have seen many cases where field services technicians do things that increase the level of risk, not necessarily because it is an intention, but because they did not know or they didn't have the proper training. So this idea of, yes, we need to ensure that we have a proper identity mechanism. Yes, then we need to have a proper authentication mechanism. That's right. But ultimately, and you made the comment, our ability to constantly monitor what's wrong on the network, or to be able to track any activity. There are many solutions emerging with AI, for example, that allows this. So that's the enforcement part that you mentioned that for me is extremely important. Is not considering that you trust that you have given to an individual or a machine at one point of time will still exist over time. So how do we ensure that over time, those changes are detected and those evolution are monitored and they are acted upon in a continuous way? I think that's extremely important.
So I want to build on this. Talk about the expanding threat surface. Last year, we were talking mostly about attacks on IT infrastructure. But since the start of this year, the trend has shifted in some very high-profile ways to OT attacks. So Cyril, securing IT versus OT, two very different challenges. Can you help our viewers understand what's involved with each and why something apparently simple on the surface is as complex as it is? And of course, after hearing from you, Cyril, I'd like to hear from our panelists as well.
I want to start with an idea. Is you speak about IT and OT, and I think in the mind of many people, they are described because we use different words are two different things, but it's not in reality. The OT network is just an extension of the IT network today. So why would we consider that things that happen on the IT space might not happen on the OT space? It just, I will say, OT is a subset of the IT infrastructure of a company altogether. So that's the reality today. When you look in the past, if I look at information industrial software, for example, that were on premise in the factory floor, yeah, but now they are connected to the cloud. Or now we have a hybrid solution, a combination of something on premise, something to the cloud. So where is the boundary? It's very difficult to define what is the boundary. So I want to start with that. So second is, I mentioned earlier, it's not just people, but it's also people and machine and equipment that could be compromised on their own. I think this is a very important dimension of OT security. We could think about people speaking to people, or we could think about machine speaking to machine and make two different cases. No, it's not like this. People speaking to machine, machine speaking to people. What happens in between those different interactions? What kind of pattern those have those interactions? And when you do this on the OT space, I was mentioning earlier the boundary effects. Any solution that is implemented has an impact on two things: the overall performance of the industrial system. We have other elements that are associated, safety related, performance related, and it also has an impact on the experience of the users. We could degrade a lot the experience, so we need to find a balance between how do we implement not only a best-in-class zero trust security approach, but also how do we deliver an experience that make it frictionless for users so that it's not a barrier to adoption. The fact that we create an experience that could be adverse to the adoption of the technology, for me, will be a problem. So what we are focusing on at Rockwell Automation is to develop those cybersecurity solutions for our customers and for our own facilities, by the way, for our own supply chain, so that there is the right experience that comes jointly with the right technology that is deployed for those solutions. That's a very important aspect. And evolving our technology stack. On a networking protocol point of view, we have been a founder and a strong supporter of ODVA, and with the Ethernet IP protocol, we are evolving SIP security so that SIP security as a security protocol on our internet infrastructure is better suited and better featured for a zero trust type of scenario where you mix people speaking to machine and machine speaking to people. So that's the approach that we are taking and my perspective on this.
Bravo, Cyril. I mean, that was so great. And to hear somebody like you talk about OT being a subset of IT, you go into places, for me, they very much, the world wants to see them as two separate things, and they don't see the interconnection of them. And it's that interconnection that is vulnerable. I remember the first time I ever saw Marcus Random speak at a Forrester event. He was talking about the unintended consequences of technology. And he was talking about how SCADA becoming on Ethernet networks was going to lead to a lot of unintended consequences, and this was 15 years ago or so, and we're seeing that happen, right? So what used to be a very insular space because it wasn't interconnected is now just part of this bigger scheme of things, and we need to think of it that way. And so the more we can merge these domains, the better off we're going to be.
Cyril, I think the thing that you brought up is so interesting by acknowledging the relationship, IT/OT, because in acknowledging the relationship, I can surface a contentious statement that there's a consistent weakness across all of the IT assets relative to zero trust and as it relates specifically to authorization. And it was brought up a little bit earlier, but I think it's super interesting to dive into the fact that information security, cybersecurity, is plagued with the same kind of historical patterns of all domains in technology and in real life, which is we simply don't learn from history, right? And when we think about authentication, if I go back 25 years ago, the biggest fight that I had was extracting authentication from application developers and putting it into a centralized service. We tend to think about multi-factor authentication now as a fait accompli, but the reality is that the ground wars to extract that from applications back in the day were difficult. They were bloody, right? And we repeated the same failure and propagated the same weakness by distributing authorization to the winds. So, Jeremy's brought up authorization in a really critical context. And the reality is that virtually no company today has authorization as a securitized layer. Authorization is just simply treated as another form of access administration. And they're fundamentally different. And this really impacts the OT space, right? Because authentication is temporal. Authentication is time bound. It is always exercised as an entry point. And frankly, I've said this about 2,000 times. It also should be enforced as an exit point for all sessions, authentication on logout. But the reality is all of this stuff that happens that nets to risk exposure and attack surface post authentication is transactional, right? It is transactional based upon the authorization layer. I get access to this asset. I get access to this microservice. I get access to this particular call. And none of that is controlled in a securitized fashion in any company of size or scale that I'm aware of. And having conversations about securitizing authorization brings in a lot of resistance because it's hard, it's complicated. We gave auth to the developers 10 years ago. People are programming in authorization calls and we have no way to see them. I've got 200 different entitlement stores. We just talked extensively about how important authorization is to zero trust. So if you're unwilling to dive into the realities of securitizing authorization, you're almost, as a statement of fact saying, I can't achieve zero trust within my organization.
You said that the big objection is that it's hard, right? And I remember one of the last times I saw Dan Kaminsky, he had just finished giving a presentation and he said, I won't listen. I'm going to paraphrase him here, but he said, I won't listen to people who say this is hard. We're in cybersecurity. We worship hard. We worship the hard things. And so if you're not, this is a hard job. There's no easy button. And you've made, we want to make it easy. We care about letting people in. And then once they're in, we don't care, right? So we don't care about logout after the session is done. And we don't care about making sure the rule we put in the firewall still needs to be there. I don't know how many times I found unused firewall rules that attackers just find, and they had no business being in the company. So, there's that's a pretty significant problem. We need to have people who have passion for achieving a mission objective to be involved more deeply in cybersecurity instead of just thinking of it as plumbing and wiring.
That question about it's hard, it's too difficult to do, comes up a lot when talking about zero trust in particular, and also associated with that, really kind of whether it's doing microsegmentation or really focusing on improving identity access management. And what I find is that the reason it's hard is not because it's necessarily technically challenging. It's because the engagement needed from teams outside security is often, particularly that initial phase, is significantly higher. And those teams often don't either have the time, resources to spend on that, or they don't really see the benefit in it for them, or what the outcome is that warrants the effort that they need to put in to really understand the behaviors that they're trying to control. And that, I think, is kind of often the greatest hurdle to making any progress, is that initial kind of inertia that needs to be overcome.
I think that's a really good point. And, we've seen this. There's a great group I know, Richard and I both participated in, Richard on the ping side, the Identity Defined Security Alliance did a survey, I think it was a little over a year ago, asking what percentage of CISOs are actually in charge of identity. And the number of people who were either in charge of it or who had strong influence over it in big enterprises was a little less than half, which actually explains how we've, had so many identity-centric attacks over the years. Is because it was viewed as something that will let HR manage because it involved employee onboarding or leaving, or, hey, the guys in IT ops will manage it. It was never treated as a security priority. And, to Raghu's point, I think this is a challenge we do see is, if you want to do this right, you need to start tying in groups that may be outside the CISO organization. This really has to be sort of, you have to look at things more holistically, as opposed to just assume that you're going to let your information security team be able to, deliver, the full set of protections you need.
Well, and Jeremy, I know that you're kind of at that intersection of cybersecurity and the legal world, right? And I just did a webinar last week with a big legal firm, and we're starting to see the lawyers really latch on to zero trust because they see how it can be used for risk mitigation. And we were talking, and I have a theory that any cybersecurity incident could have been mitigated for less than the cost of the legal fees that were subsequent to it. So there's going to be some other drivers here at a grand strategic level inside of organizations. And I've always found it somewhat difficult to get, the rank and file folks who do the work to want to do more work, right? They're worried that they're going to do more work. And I've tried to make zero trust very simple, but the people it resonates to who change the incentives inside of an organization are the leadership, right? I've done this in manufacturing organizations and governmental organizations, and we're seeing President Biden change the incentive structure by issuing an executive order. And quite frankly, that's what we need folks like you in the risk management legal world to do as well, because that drives a lot of the best practices that we're going to adopt in the future.
Gentlemen, I want to hit a couple more topics before we wrap up here. And the first is complexity. In cybersecurity, thrashing occurs when there are too many tactical security solutions, technologies, and tools employed without a strategic focus. It creates a complex and incomprehensible operating environment that frankly overwhelms an organization's available resources, their people, their time, their funding, and it results in a poor situational awareness and certainly insecure systems. So my question, and Raghu, I'd love for you to start with this. How does a zero trust strategy overcome this complexity, which is one of our most obvious barriers to security?
I honestly believe is that how we get over complexity is not trying to essentially eat the whole pie in one go, right? And it's very much about being, while you have the zero trust is the strategy, right? And then you take a very tactical approach to actually executing it. And that helps you reduce your complexity because sort of John spoke about the 5 steps, right? And he very much described it as an iterative approach to continuously improving your security posture. So without kind of repeating that, one key part of that is that at every stage when you evaluate, have I made progress? Each of those kind of cycles of iteration offers an opportunity to look at the current state of the resources that you're utilizing and determine whether there's any rationalization that can be done to reduce that complexity. Because I think if we kind of go back to some of the other points, right, what we want to do as part of this transformation is improve security, but also at the same time improve the operational the ability to operationalize and maintain and retain that evergreen status, right? Sort of thinking about the zero trust, sort of the 7 pillars, automation and orchestration are a key part of that. So this needs to be woven as part of that strategy. And then in each tactical step, it needs to be a key focus of that is that I've got this far. How do I now look at what I've done and how can I simplify and how can I rationalize so that I don't just leave technical debt lying around for someone else to solve? That's a key part of success.
You've kind of scratched at the surface of what I feel about this notion of complexity, which is the rationalization. It's not a reality, right? The argument of complexity is constantly dropped into the discussion around budgetary decisions, prioritizations for risk reductions and mitigations, risk acceptances. And let's face it, 8 copies of production data is not complexity. It's self-inflicted complexity, right? Associating encryption keys to a functional role is not complexity. It is a choice that was made for convenience, the sake of speed, access. However, it is a choice that resulted in one of the most massive frauds ever committed in the cloud. Right, when a production account was used to copy an S3 bucket and the encryption keys then were associated to the S3 bucket and the S3 bucket wasn't monitored after a copy was made. That is manufactured complexity, right? That is not real complexity. That is self-inflicted wounds. And I think that when we look at the nature of cybersecurity, I think we need to address the complexity issue with intellectual honesty. And I think that that is what is often missing within C-suites and organizations, an intellectual honesty that suggests that A, the reason that we're currently in the state that we're in is because we have placed ourselves there. And B, there is nothing that is not technologically unsolvable relative to cybersecurity. There is an issue of cost compromises and acceptable compromises that have to be, sorted out. And when we look at this, world of cybersecurity, and we look at the last 3 years in particular, the argument can clearly be made that people are not getting crushed with sexier and sexier and more complicated hacks. We are getting defeated by simpler and simpler hacks and breaches and exploits and methods. And if we're crying complexity, but the bad guys are winning on simplicity, then there is a massive intellectual gap there that we actually need to acknowledge, resolve, and choose to say we have a very complex environment, but there are pathways to solve those problems.
So if you implement your solution by properly designing the experience centered on your actual assets and your actual users, there is no fundamental reason that you add complexity. You can even improve the overall experience. Richard, the identity industry coming from Ping. When you look at about what was password usage or identification years back, and the type of experience that we are able to deliver now, it's the opposite of complexity. I think it's very straightforward and leverage the best of the technology, your mobile phone or whatever. There is no reason that we cannot reach a similar type of pattern for zero trust. If we decide to implement it the right way, and if we decide to focus on users and their experiences altogether.
Yeah, there's too much focus on product, right? I'm often on calls where all the vendors are trying to position their product, and you need all of us. And then I'll say, well, what are you trying to protect? And they'll go, we haven't thought about that yet. And so once you understand what you're trying to protect, it will tell you what technology you need, and the technology will typically be collapsed. You will need less technologies than you would have otherwise done, because you're very focused on something, not just scatter shooting and that whole defense in depth principle, or what Rick Holland, my friend from Forrester's, called expense in depth. And so, there's two separate incentives, right? You have the vendors who need to sell product, and we're all, a lot of us anyway in this call are part of that. But at the same time, there's organizations who need to have a security objective. You will see a reduction in the number of technologies you need, and you will see a reduction in the complexity of the policies, in the complexity of various rules. And so it becomes much more streamlined when you go about it from the inside out and start with the things that you need to protect.
It's not, I need a zero trust product, is that I need to improve the security of my operations. And zero trust is one element of it in an overall experience that integrates every aspect, the network, the assets themselves, the way you manage software in your different assets and everything. It's because you look at what problem you want to solve, what kind of security level you want to have in your facilities, that you pull the right technologies and the right competencies in order to solve it, and not the other way around.
One of the problems I've seen over the years in cybersecurity, years of roaming the RSA show floor, reminds me of the equivalent in cybersecurity of, if you guys remember the hospital scene in Monty Python's Meaning of Life, where, the press comes in and you got all these rooms. Oh, what's that one? Oh, that's our most expensive and exotic machine. It goes bing. And historically, we've had a lot of products that have been, sort of the equivalent of that in the cybersecurity world. Here's a network appliance, you put it in and it looks for this one novel kind of attack and goes bing. And, a lot of folks in cybersecurity, I'm going to race toward that because there's this advanced attack I'm worried about. And you're suddenly managing 23 of these things and basically getting DDoSed by all the alerts that you're getting. You can't manage anything well. And I think that the beauty of shifting to a zero trust model allows you to abandon a lot of these things. And actually, I think to the point of John and other speakers, focus on where the attacks are coming from, take a more simple and elegant approach that lets me just focus those resources on a few critical controls and away from some of these, they sound good, but at the end of the day, they're not actually stopping the attackers where they're coming in.
So, gentlemen, some closing thoughts. Let's talk about the future of zero trust. Elements of zero trust, simple. They all make sense. The objective is to reduce the attack surface, increase visibility to critical threats, segment off our crucial assets, and perform rigorous identity proofing for access along the way. Now, that said, some people are of the opinion that zero trust requires new technologies. So my question is, what are the future requirements to optimize zero trust in our environments? Jeremy, I'd be honored if you'd start off, please.
I think in terms of future requirements, look, as more and more enterprises move towards zero trust, the attackers are going to evolve because they always do. And we're going to start, I think, to see a need to pivot again in terms of how we approach security, maybe just focusing on how we approach certain elements of zero trust. We're seeing this a lot in my world with multi-factor authentication, where I think the message is really quickly shifting from, hey, just make sure you have MFA, to making sure that you're using phishing resistant MFA like FIDO, because we're seeing one-time passcodes and push and SMS are all getting phished pretty regularly now. In fact, this was a big feature of the Biden administration's new zero trust strategy from a few weeks ago. So I think it'll be a combination of shifts like that to guard against new attacks, as well as a need for more tools in the zero trust world to just make the whole implementation and operation side of thing easier.
The thing we need most is people to be willing to adopt this strategy and start to implement it in an incremental way, and not be afraid of it, not be afraid of doing a new thing, and not be inhibited by what they've always done, right? So I've had people even recently say, well, I can't do it because I just bought this one technology and it's not useful for zero trust. So I have to wait till that's up for renewal. So I have budget for something new. So again, it's the political stuff, as Richard said. The technologies will get better and better over time. They always have. But adopting the strategy will align the business needs and the technological needs. And so adoption is key.
Yeah, to rebound on this is what for me is important is change management, education, training, grounding the topic of zero trust from into reality, demonstrating practical implementation and demonstrating to people that what we discussed earlier, complexity, sophistication is not a curse. It can be avoided if we focus on the right things, if we do practical incremental implementations, focusing on people and experiences that matters in the overall deployment. So this element of change management for me is more critical than technology. I think there are a lot, some of them are here, great technology vendors in the space of zero trust. So the technology is available. What matters is how you drive change in organizations so that they apply this technology in the right way in order to achieve the business objectives that they have.
Just add from the solution side of the house, and I think I can say this with some integrity, since I've only been in the solutions side for a few years and I spent a whole lot in the corporate side, is just that solutions providers writ large need to stop being disingenuous about their association to a specific security architecture or framework, right? In fact, we've talked about it at the top of the discussion, right? Identity has a part to play in zero trust, as do all of the recognized security control domains, right? And it's disingenuous to argue nits and gnats around whether zero trust has been subrogated by marketing messages, because if we look at defense in depth as an example, really all that is overlapping controls, right? And so, and overlapping controls have been a structure that have existed for years and years and years, and it's been effective when it's implemented effectively. Suggesting it's something different because we put a different name on it is a disingenuousness that I'm talking about. So this is back to this notion of intellectual honesty, is a way to get us to move forward on adoption, which I think is absolutely critical. And I think that we've got too much noise, right? And practitioners need to be focused on empirical evidence, data, and the most important thing, which is when a CISO buys a solution, the return on investment should be associated to the reduction in inherent and residual risk. And if it's not, then it's aligned to the wrong purpose and function for the acquisition of that solution. And I think the other thing that's really important to think about is not all old things are terrible, right? So things like Demings, continuous process improvement, TPM, right? Applying that to a zero trust effort where you are continuously looking for information from the feedback loop that John mentioned in step 5, and using that to continuously reduce residual and inherent risk by improving is exactly what the evolution of zero trust can and should look like.
A malware developer who works for the Revil ransomware gang said in an interview recently, he said that we hear all of sort of organizations, security professionals talk a lot about zero trust controls, right? Microsegmentation, in doing better identity and access management. But we know as attackers that they talk about it, but they never actually go and implement these improvements, which means that from our perspective, and to go back to sort of a previous point that Richard made, it's the same attacks we see repeated, that continue to be successful because the attackers know that nothing really changes. And why is that? Well, is it a problem that when we think about it, about how do we drive adoption, really it's like a 4-pillared thing. You need to have the right tools, but we know that technologies exist already, or there are obviously a plethora of vendors out there selling good technologies. So technology exists. The ability to write and build a proper governance process to use that can also be done, right? We've done that for lots of other technologies before. The two key things though, the application owners who actually own the data, the systems that we're trying to protect, they need to understand the benefits. They need to be engaged, and the mandate needs to come from sort of the CISO, the CIO level, that this is something that must be done. Why? Because for long, we've essentially said, I can do risk acceptance, and that's fine, right? I can accept risks. Really, what we want to drive is risk mitigation, risk reduction, and that needs the strong mandate and also the engagement of the folks who actually own the business process or the assets being protected.
Well, very good, gentlemen. Terrific conversation. I'm really grateful for this. So each of you, thank you so much for taking time to share your insights, your candor, your hope on the topic of zero trust today. Very grateful. Thank you. I appreciate you taking time to give us your time and attention for this discussion today. And please stay tuned for future cybersecurity leadership discussions just like this one. This is where we take the big topics that everybody is talking about and break them down into the smaller focused conversations that, frankly, not enough people are having. So thank you for your time and attention. For Information Security Media Group, I'm Tom Field. Look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.